The following is a presentation of New Worker Radio. The views and opinions expressed therein do not necessarily represent those of WZML, its staff, or management.
Hello, and welcome to New Worker News on WZML 92.9. My name is Manolis, bringing you national and international updates from a worker's perspective. To begin, here is Yanis with the local news.
For our first story, we take a look at the precise analysis of the Trump administration by the newspaper Nuevo Rumbo of the Communist Workers' Party of Spain. Immediately after winning the election, re-elected U.S. President Donald Trump launched experiments to gauge the public's interest regarding what could initially be understood as barbarities, that is, annexing Greenland and Canada, retaking the Panama Canal, taking control of the Gaza Strip, and finally leaving Ukraine in the lurch by demanding trillions in compensation, closing one front to open another. These ideas were interpreted from some media pulpits as the bravado of an eccentric or fascist president. The problem here is that annexations and war are not the result of bravado. They are not the delusions of these or those leaders. If they were, it would be enough to subject them and their advisors to psychological therapy to appease their most quarrelsome impulses. On the contrary, we speak of the needs and demands of the imperialists as a class, not because they are greedy, but because that is how capitalism works, through competition, the drive for profit, the maintenance and expansion of markets, etc. To understand this imperialist aggression beyond the psychological profiles so popular on television talk shows and other news media outlets, we must put some data in black and white. The United States GDP grew by 2.7% in 2024, faster than any other G7 power, but much slower than its competitor China. It is important to note that, throughout Biden's term, China grew faster than the United States, and the same could be said of GDP per capita. For its part, the United States has a trade deficit of $900 billion and a negative balance of accounts with other countries. The liabilities of the balance sheets of large U.S. financial and industrial companies show large obligations and debts to the rest of the world. An economic recession was avoided in 2023 and 2024. The world's largest economy enjoyed a soft landing after the pandemic, but not without periods of contraction in manufacturing activity and the banking system being shaken in the first 4 months of 2023 with the bankruptcy of Silicon Valley Bank and other financial institutions. The widespread impoverishment of the U.S. working class undoubtedly played a significant role in the Democrats' defeat. Inflation also hit the country hard, with prices rising 21% since 2020. Furthermore, mortgage rates rose, health and car insurance became more expensive, and the credit that sustains the middle classes contracted with rising interest rates. Inequality increased during the Biden administration. It was a good time for the bourgeoisie, a bad time for the working class. Given this scenario, Trump is not so much the cause or driving force behind certain policies, but rather the personalization of them, as a need for large U.S. monopolies, corporations, and multinationals to boost their horses in their race against emerging powers. Trump's economic nationalism is, in short, protectionism, that is, increasing the cost of imports, reducing demand for foreign goods and services, and the serious U.S. trade deficit. In turn, it requires foreign companies to invest and operate on U.S. soil. This economic program is coupled with racism and a frontal attack on critical class organizations and social movements. This is not new, nor does it signal the beginning of a new era. State intervention in times of crisis or heightened international conflict is as old as capitalism itself. The state is that institutional framework that, in a market where private and independent agents compete, establishes order to ensure the continuation of the market. We can point to the great crises in the history of capitalism, which were resolved with war, authoritarianism, and New World divisions as historical examples. The Great Depression was resolved through war and an authoritarian and nationalist closure of governance in the world's major economies. The crisis of the 1970s was resolved by imposing trade deregulation and labor flexibility on third world countries, and largely on the working class at the top of imperialism, the famous so-called structural adjustments of so-called neoliberalism. Returning to the present, the Trump administration will most likely largely continue Biden's economic policy, where economic growth depends entirely on government subsidies and grants to large industry, as well as to large technology companies, supporting the ever-increasing investments needed, backing financial institutions, and thus encouraging the supply of private capital increasingly committed to the ideal collective capitalism, which is also known as the state. Faced with the low profitability of industrial capital, the main engine of economic growth, the solution presented to the economic structure of the leading power is the increase in labor productivity. This may help to better understand the alliance represented by Trump and Musk, which is much more complex than a simple alliance between two eccentric figures with right-wing ideas. Large technology companies, heavily subsidized and dependent on large infrastructures, are fundamental to the modernization of the productive fabric and international competition spurred by robotization and automation. The U.S. imperialist state ensures control of raw materials and trade routes and guarantees investments with the dollar as the dominant currency in the market. This is important to understand because the problems of the political economy of capitalism are not merely technical, such as low profitability or the inability of the labor market to absorb surplus population. The class struggle unfolds internationally through the channels of imperialism with its military, judicial, cultural, and other implications. We have multiple examples. The so-called ecological transition or the development and implementation of new technologies are completely embedded in the dynamics of imperialism. The technologies needed to produce, process, and store energy require investment, infrastructure, and the massive exploitation of all kinds of natural resources, which are not always abundant. The paradox of green capitalism, or the Industrial Revolution 4.0, in the United States known as the Green New Deal, is that its realization requires a further escalation of the exploitation of the human and natural resources of all the world's peoples. And with this underlying problem in mind, these territorial conflicts that Trump has brought to the table can be understood. Of course, not all imperialist conglomerates and monopolies are willing to cede the market and its resources to the U.S. power. The expansion of imperialism through capital exports favored the historical emergence of the bourgeois class throughout the world. This accumulation brought new nations to the surface throughout the 20th century, which, in a subsequent intensification of international competition, necessitated total intervention by imperialist alliances and institutions dominated by the United States, for example, NATO and the International Monetary Fund. These include coups d'etats, trade sanctions, lawsuits, and even outright military invasions against nations on all continents in recent decades. The transfer of technology from China to third world countries or the development orientation of its partners may have similar effects in the future. The emergence of new powers, that is, the reorganization of the imperialist pyramid, has obstructed some channels through which wealth flowed to the countries that dominated at the top, the United States, the EU, Japan, etc. The rise of Russia, China, India, and other regional powers has led to a greater strategic balance between links in the imperialist chain and greater interdependence among countries around the world. The loot is increasingly being fought over by more plunderers. Faced with this situation, the United States appears to be seeking to shorten value chains, make the circulation of its capital and resources less dependent on its competitors, open new trade routes in contrast to the Chinese Silk Roads, and restore the flow of capital accumulation. It is a commonplace that there is nothing more dangerous than a mortally wounded empire. It is evident that imperialism, as it has existed until now, is entering a phase of high volatility. This process will be carried out not only with tariffs, but with war and other forms of intervention, reminding us daily that the trees of capitalist civilization grow on layers of unpaid mass labor, environmental plunder, and violence. And no class-conscious worker should doubt that all the world's imperialists, regardless of their poll and nationality, religion, skin color, or political party, will attempt to join this exploitation. In other national news, President Trump has fulfilled a controversial campaign promise and signed an executive order dissolving the Department of Education. The decision is met with widespread criticism and could lead to a political tug-of-war in Congress. The Department of Education, established in 1979 under President Jimmy Carter, has been the focus of conservative politicians for years. They argue that education policy is the responsibility of the states and that the institution is so-called tainted with liberal ideas. However, abolishing the agency will be legally and politically difficult to implement because only Congress can abolish a cabinet-level department. Trump justified his decision by citing the poor performance of students in the United States. According to the executive order titled Improving Educational Outcomes by Empowering Parents, States, and Communities, the department's closure is intended to help children escape a system that has failed them. Secretary of Education Linda McMahon was directed to coordinate the transition. The order is facing considerable opposition. According to a 2024 poll by the organization All for Ed, 58% of Americans, regardless of party affiliation, oppose abolishing the Department of Education. The president of the American Council of Education, Ted Mitchell, warned that abolishing the agency could have a significant consequence for higher education and student loan forgiveness. The Department of Education manages approximately $1.69 trillion in outstanding student loans for 43 million borrowers. Trump emphasized that loans and grants will continue to be issued with a plan to transfer their management to the Small Business Administration. Many universities are already preparing for cuts. Some institutions, including Duke University, have announced hiring freezes and cost-cutting measures. While the Department of Education is moving toward its possible dissolution, it is by no means sitting idle. Under the leadership of the Trump administration, the agency is intensifying its investigations into universities that allegedly engage in racial discrimination in admissions or scholarships. The so-called PhD project, which aims to promote Black and Hispanic students in economics, has been particularly targeted. These measures are part of the government's comprehensive campaign against diversity programs. The financial pressure is already having an effect, with most of the affected universities having agreed to cooperate with the investigating authorities, presumably also out of fear of cuts or a freeze in federal funding. Universities are under pressure to adapt to the Trump administration's policies. For example, the University of Pennsylvania recently had its federal funding withdrawn because it allowed transgender athletes access to women's sports. Columbia University is also affected, having $400 million in research funding frozen and government demands to take measures against so-called anti-Semitism on campus. Whether Trump's decrees will be implemented now depends on Congress. Senator Bill Cassidy announced he will introduce legislation to abolish the department, but even with a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, it could be difficult to achieve the necessary 60 votes in the Senate. A similar proposal failed in 2023 because 60 Republican representatives also opposed it. The current distribution of seats in the Senate, which is 53 Republicans, 47 Democrats, makes it unlikely that such a measure would find the necessary majority. While Trump is selling his decision as a necessary step for education policy, critics see it as an attempt to weaken the federal government's influence on the school system, with uncertain consequences for millions of pupils and students in the United States.
We'll be right back with more of New Worker News here on 92.9 FM WZML. But I want to remind you that every day throughout this country, workers are subjected to injustices and humiliation at the hands of the capitalists, from unpaid wages to mass layoffs. So we at New Worker understand the tyranny that the workplace is for workers. This is why we fight to expose these injustices. Only through militant organization of the working class can we stand toe-to-toe against the bosses. So this is why we want to hear from you, the listener. Are you having issues at work? bosses cutting your hours or wages? Are you or your fellow workers' safety being thrown out of the window in the name of ever-increasing profit? Well, you are not alone, so reach out to us to tell your story. You can anonymously send an email or even a voice memo to cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that is cwpusa@protonmail.com. And check us out online at newworker.us. And now back to New Worker Radio, only here on 92.9 FM, WZML.
In other national news, the limits of the freedom that prevails at U.S. universities are revealed by the new persecutions against students at various institutions throughout the country. One example is Columbia University, where students are not only arrested through unacceptable procedures, but also have their visas revoked, simply because they do not bow their heads in the face of the silence that the government wants to impose for the crime in Gaza. The arrest of 30-year-old Turkish woman Rümeysa Öztürk, a doctoral student and a scholarship holder at Tufts University, left her home to meet friends in Somerville, near Boston, and was arrested by agents of the Department of Homeland Security. In videos circulating online, Öztürk, a student in the Child Studies and Development Program, is seen being arrested by masked and hooded officers. A Department of Homeland Security spokesman claimed that Öztürk is, quote, engaging in activities in support of Hamas, a foreign terrorist organization that seeks to kill U.S. citizens, end quote. It should be noted that a year ago, Öztürk, writing in a student newspaper, criticized the cooperation of universities with investors active in Israel. Öztürk's lawyer, Masa Hanbabe, filed a lawsuit claiming that the 30-year-old's detention is illegal. According to related reports, although a federal judge in Boston ordered that Öztürk not be moved outside the state of Massachusetts without 48 hours' notice, by the next evening she was already in Louisiana after her visa was revoked. In recent weeks alone, an Iranian student at the University of Alabama, a Korean-American student at Columbia, a Gambian student at Cornell University, an Indian scholar at Georgetown in Washington, and a Lebanese doctor at Brown University Medical School in Rhode Island have been arrested and or expelled from the U.S. with visa revoking. In this climate of intimidation, Columbia's administration, caving to the threats of the Trump administration, announced a series of so-called reforms to its operating rules, such as a new definition of anti-Semitism and further staffing of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies in the name of so-called intellectual diversity. In international news, the U.S. is seeking to control investments in Ukraine. As competing plans within the Euro-Atlantic axis for Ukraine and the geopolitical balance of power in Europe intensify, at the Paris summit, there was a consensus on the need to give impetus to the plan for the rearmament of Europe, that is, to the very large increase in military armaments, with an emphasis on the European war industries, but also to the representation of European terms and interests in any peace talks. For its part, the United States is promoting an economic agreement to carve up Ukraine in order to control future investments in mineral wealth and strategic infrastructure, wanting to exclude other competitors, primarily China, but also to determine what investments can be made by EU states and Britain. According to Bloomberg, citing a draft of the agreement, if the partnership agreement is ultimately accepted, it will give the U.S. enormous power to control investments in Ukraine in infrastructure, roads and railways, ports, mines, oil and gas, and extraction of critical minerals. In the current draft, the agreement has no time limit. Washington is pressuring Kiev to potentially gain a veto on any role for the Ukrainians' other allies. The U.S. government is demanding a right of first refusal on investments in all infrastructure and natural resource projects, demanding that the Ukrainian government be prohibited from offering projects rejected by the United States to other parties on significantly better terms for at least a year, and prohibiting Kiev from selling critical minerals to countries that are strategic competitors of the U.S. If signed in this form, the agreement would represent an unprecedented expansion of U.S. economic influence in Europe's largest country, at a time when it is attempting to align itself with the EU. If the US has full control over investment decisions covering large parts of Ukraine's economy, Ukraine's prospects for EU membership are complicated. Kiev has said that a deal with the United States should not conflict with the association agreement with the EU. Moreover, according to the draft, the United States will have the first role in terms of profits transferred to the Special Reconstruction Investment Fund, which will be controlled by Washington, with 3 out of 5 members of the board of directors and a golden share. The document states that the U.S. considers the military and economic assistance provided to Ukraine since the Russian invasion in February 2022 as its contribution to this fund. Therefore, Kiev would not receive anything from the investment fund until it repays the U.S. aid. The Ukrainian government would be required to put 50% of its revenues from all new natural resources and infrastructure projects into the fund. The U.S. would be entitled to all profits plus 4% annual return until its investment is recouped, the draft states. These bargains are within the context of a partial and fragile ceasefire agreement between Putin and Trump. Such agreements do not establish Trump as a peacemaker, since such characterizations are a provocation to the people who are and have experienced the barbarity of U.S. imperialism. Any agreement reached does not erase the real cause of imperialist war, which is based on competition for control of markets and resources. It is an imperialist peace which is reached on the basis of the interests of the capitalists and their alliances on both sides of the table. Both sides, that is, the US, NATO, and EU on one side, and on the other, Russia, while speaking about a ceasefire, are intensifying war preparations. In more international news, the US is proposing a drastic upgrade of military plans and equipment in the Indo-Pacific and more generally. The new head of the US Pentagon, Pete Hegseth, from Honolulu, where he began an official tour of the Asia-Pacific, announced the current administration's doctrine to ensure peace through strength, through a so-called America First approach. Speaking from the podium of the Center for Asia-Pacific Security Studies, the U.S. Secretary of Defense added that the administration will propose as key goals the so-called restoration of the warrior ethos, the rebuilding of our armed forces, and the establishment of deterrence capacity, confirming that imperialist rivalries are heating up all around the world. Hegseth stressed that the U.S. will work with all of its allies to deter China and their presence in the Indo-Pacific. Against the backdrop of the effort to upgrade investment partnerships of U.S. military groups, Hegseth emphasized that Washington will prioritize opportunities for cooperation with military industries and will push hard to expand production and fast-track deliveries. He referred to the recent White House announcement that efforts will immediately begin for domestic production of a new 6th-generation fighter jet, the F-47, which will replace the F-22 and F-35 in the Air Force fleet. After Hawaii, Hegseth continued his tour to the island of Guam, a U.S. colony in the South Pacific that hosts one of the most critical U.S. bases in the region. In Guam, Hegseth emphasized the Department of Defense's view of deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the Northern Mariana Islands and Micronesia, as the tip of the spear. Hegseth was briefed on future construction and growth on the island of Guam, further turning the island into a base of U.S. imperialist interests to compete with its rival, China.
You've been listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML, your home for local, national, and international news, all from a working class perspective. New Worker News is the official organ of the Communist Workers Platform. If you're a worker, we would like to hear from you. You can reach us at cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that's cwpusa@protonmail.com. If you would like more news from a worker's point of view, visit us at newworker.us. You can find weekly articles on events happening all over the country and internationally. If you've enjoyed the program and wish to see more working class reporting, consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/New Worker. And thank you for listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML.